Hello there, and welcome back to our Orlando time-lapse series. In today's episode, we will continue on this side of the main street and start with the colonnade on the very right side of it. I wanted to note here at the beginning that within this episode you will see a lot of swift camera movement, even to that extent that it's annoying to watch, and for that I just wanted to say sorry. Most of the time I think about that I don't wiggle too much with the camera, just because the footage that I'm recording is later than sped up by 10 times. But since we are working on this colonnade now, it's a lot more tricky just because it's working in a 3D space. Most of the time when we constructing a building, we work on this one side, this one facade, and we don't have to move around there so much. So maybe that's another reason why it's so wiggly today, just because I have to check each column that it's in the exact location where it should be. So before I start talking about this area a lot more in detail and my general thoughts and approach on it, I wanted to note here that when you are seeing this episode, I will be gone into a vacation for 2 weeks, and so within this time frame there will be no videos coming. However, this video that you are currently watching, I doubled the length of it, so we are up to 50 or 60 minutes to compensate that. And besides that, I think you also need that within this episode to properly show the progress on this colonnade, and where it doesn't make any sense now to split it up just because the episode would get too long for it. So at this point, let's talk about this area and this column system again. So the first thing that you are noticing is that I constantly copy over the stuff that I built on the left side to the right side, and that is just mainly because it's the natural continuation of this column system. And so at the start here where I'm doing this, I was still unsure a bit how I make that continuation now in the game. I mean, those columns, they had now the same distance to each other, but in the other direction where you see pretty much nothing right now, I had to define the spacing in between those columns. And the thing was that I couldn't just simply measure out now the distance just from Google Maps, for example. I had to apply now this column logic within this new area. You have there this entrance area where the top part of this colonnade gets wider and where the whole thing steps forward. And then you even have this curved section on the right of it, which is just so tricky to build. I will talk about that later on, how tricky that actually is. And so the approach how I dealt with this area was to measure out the middle point of this entrance, since this entrance is also in line with the building in the rear back. And once I had this midpoint, I could build now those colonnades on the right and left of it. And once I had that, I could just simply apply now also the distance that you see on the roof itself to those colonnades in relation to that. I mean, it sounds complicated, but you will see it here in a minute. I think just here. And once I had that, I could just apply this logic throughout this whole area later on. So something that I noticed just here is that the distance between the colonnade and the facade of the theater was a little bit off, and the proportion not made enough sense there to me. And so I decided to select pretty much this facade and also the facade of the restaurant and move them into the back like 1 meter or something like that, or half a meter. It was really not that much. But now the proportion of it, when you look on the side of it, makes much more sense and is also accurate to the thing in real life. And by the way, I cut out the footage of actually selecting all those pieces, and beforehand I had to optimize those scenery groups so that I could select them in one go. And you don't want to see 1 hour of just doing that, right? But however, this tiny change makes sense now. Also, when you look on the roof of those colonnades, how they attach themselves to the theater itself. And I think it's much better to do that now until later on, when we have then to adjust maybe this curved section on the colonnade, which is like absolute nightmare stuff. But yeah, overall this work was kinda tedious and it took really a long time. I kinda underestimated that. I wouldn't say it was particularly hard to create that, except the curved section, but there were so many reappearing things and where you have always to make sure that they look exactly the same. And for instance, if you make a change to one of them, you have to reapply this change to all of them. So in that regard, really tedious stuff to do, but whenever something like this happens, my autopilot is kicking in and I just don't think too much about it anymore. And well, maybe this is another big topic, to not overthink it. I mean, normally I like to pre-plan as much as I can before I start building. So for instance, on this side of the main street, the very first thing that I noticed was that you have there so many repeating building elements and that the architecture repeats itself throughout this whole area. And that meant even before I started building, I had to choose for certain pieces and pre-plan in before that they will fit later on all those elements throughout the build that reappear. So for instance, on the trim, I used all of those items in a very small scale and also with pieces that are relatively flexible and that you can adjust to smaller sizes. So for instance, when you come to the round section later on, you can modify those pieces. So to an extent, it's great to overthink it a little bit in before. There's a healthy balance between that. At some point, it just doesn't make sense to invest more into that overthinking before. You just have to start and improvise on the way going. Otherwise, you will never be finished. And in this particular build here, there were also many moments and situations where I just had to improvise and where you really can pre-plan that. It's just something that happens out of your building technique and also sometimes just out of pure luck and randomness. And those moments are always very satisfying when you find the perfect piece for something and where you almost get the impression that this piece was designed for that. So at least for me, this is the perfect, let's call it Planco moment, where I get the most joy out of this game on the building side. And it's a really cool relief sometimes to have that, because most of the time I'm pretty depressed or let's say not amused about all the limitations of scaling, and you try out all of those pieces and they don't fit, and it's really a struggle sometimes to find the right pieces. And when there is a piece that fits so perfectly, it gives of course you a great satisfaction. In the end, the biggest enjoyment I of course get when I see what I've built so far, or to see this whole scene of it and to remember where you started and where all those tricky bits were, and then you build something in a specific way. It's always nice to review your own creation. In that way you also figure out some issues or mistakes that it has. So when I see my footage here live, there are constantly spots where I say you can improve that, and I see myself from the third person then. Because when I'm building live in the park, I don't think about that other perspective and I just keep on doing what I'm doing. And so I think it's reasonable and helpful if you distance yourself a little bit from yourself. I hope that makes sense in some way. But whenever I take this third person perspective on anything that I'm doing here in the footage, it helps me identify those spots where I can make certain things much better. So I take the role of you as you are watching. And so when you are constantly switching between those two modes, it's a little bit schizophrenic, but within this ambivalence of me building and me watching what I'm building, I have a certain dialogue going on. that is back and forth. And so each time I'm going back into it and start building, I have a different mindset. And I think this helps tremendously that you don't get burned out just of doing this work, but also that you get fresh ideas and inspiration and also motivation that you keep doing it. Otherwise, if I would just stubborn build and don't think about it too much, I don't think that the result that you would end up with would come even close to what we are creating here. And so maybe this is the crucial thing that makes the difference in the end. That it's not only purely about the building stage, but maybe much more importantly about the interpretation of what we are building and the constant back and forth of improving that. And I don't know about you, but I believe within those videos, they are a great help for me to express that second layer of it. Without them, this dialogue would be only within myself, like it was most of the time when I recreated Anaheim. And so it's of course very great for me to finally reveal this other side and to show it here in those videos. It's almost like I was the whole time numb and I couldn't talk. I would only think those things that I was creating, and to finally have the ability to speak about it, I can't tell you how relieving this is. I don't want to get too personal here. Maybe you guessed already that I'm a bit more of a shy person or an introvert. But since I created those videos, the more I do it each week, I feel just much more open to myself and also to the exterior around me. And that's really something I didn't expect it. I mean, it's great to recreate those parks and to have that fascination about it and to see it also so appreciated by you guys. But the fact that it impacts myself as a human being, I really didn't expect that. And who knows, maybe in a couple of months from now, this will change even more. So I'm pretty excited that this is happening, and it's really uncertain where it will go to in the future. But maybe at this stage, let's come back to the build, since I see for several minutes now this tricky bit here on this round section. And so from all the parts of this side of the main street, I think that this innocent looking area is the very most difficult part of this whole site. I believe that there are certain types of difficulty, so they are not the same. For instance, you can have there a building that is very hard to construct just on the pure architecture style and to find the right pieces for that. Or like here, it's more about the accuracy and the creation of a round element that within this game is just pretty difficult to construct by itself. So I said that now multiple times in all those episodes that round parts, and especially round parts that go up and down, are by far the most difficult part. And since we have here now this colonnade that goes into this 90-degree round section, all elements that are attached on this colonnade have to move into that turn. So the first thing I had to make sure here on this curved section was that the width of the roof, when you look from above, is the same width like on those other colonnades on the left side. And that's also the thing why you see me start with the trim area, because it defines the width of the roof. And the column underneath it just gets in the location in relation to that trim area throughout all of the system. So the next thing was to get now this round shape, and I used for reference an art piece for that to get that perfect 90-degree shape. And as you see, I made those short sections of the trim area, and I did my best to position them now along this shape. So on the inner section of this curve, it worked pretty good. But when I tried then to do the outer section of it, there wasn't any art piece anymore in this big scale. And so eventually I found another piece that is completely different, and it's one of those wooden columns that is formed in a 90-degree shape. So it's a wooden trim or something like that, I don't know exactly, but it worked pretty good here. And then I could do the same thing now on the outer section. So once I had them in place, I could just copy the elements of that to the right and left of it to get those crossing edges between them. So whenever I have to create a round building and you have their scenery attached to them and they have to move with them, I use this method to create that. And even back in the prequel, I used that method. So for instance, on Space Mountain, or also on the Star Wars launch bay building. So for instance, I can imagine later on when we are constructing the central hub at the very end of the main street, that we also rely on this method, since it's a circle. So the difficult part here was not necessarily now this method to create round objects and buildings, but to keep in mind at the same time the perfect width on the roof, and that both sections are exactly 90-degree shaped. So you can't have really there any intolerances just because you will see that immediately. You will see if there is a little dent in this curvature. And so this was the tricky part about that. But until this stage I didn't notice that there will be, in short, a much more difficult problem than that. So what is this round section actually about? What's the purpose of that? When you remember to the other side we built on, there was a section where you had a very long ramp to access the railroad station. And so we have here something similar to that, but we don't access the railroad station, we just access the elevated terrace here. And therefore we have a ramp here within this round section. And that means of course that I have to provide any surface or floor where you can walk upon. And so normally if you just have a linear ramp, it's pretty easy, right? You just have an incline there and it's working. But since it's also rounded at the same time, this incline of it, to recreate that now with any piece, it's pretty horrendous to do that, because you incline it in two different axes at the same time. But I will talk about it a little bit more when we are getting there. And so for now, as you see me continue on this side and also working now on the entrance of this column section, I would like to talk a little bit more about the upcoming membership on this channel. I mean, I teased it a little bit in the last episode at the very end of it, but I didn't have enough time there to really properly explain it. So let's do that. So from 2017, where I started with the Anaheim project, until today, where I continued now with the Orlando project, my main goal and the core driving factor was always the fascination of seeing a theme park that is built realistically and one-to-one in a video game. And it's not only seeing that, but also experiencing it through the game mechanics. And that's the great part about Planet Coaster, that it gives you now this ability to not only create a park and to just visually see it, but you can also interact with it. And so that's kind of the thing. In those videos here, you only see the park. And for some people, this is enough, and I can understand that. And it's always great to check by and to see the progress on a weekly basis maybe, and to see that park grow over time. But there are also people that are so hyped about this whole thing and are really a hardcore fan, so to say, that they would like not only to see it in those videos, but instead on their own within the game itself. And I can very well understand that, because you will just see behind the curtain and can actually stroll around already, and you are not bound anymore to this time lapse solely. You can figure out how I build certain buildings and take inspiration out of that for maybe your own park. And therefore I don't want to limit yourself anymore of that, so that you can finally load this park in the Frontier workshop. And so since we now have this Frontier workshop, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. It's not that easy anymore like in the Steam workshop where you could unlist your creation in the workshop and only people with the link could visit your creation and download it and play it. You only have now two options. Either you make your park public or you make your park private. And there's no way to get access to your park when it's private. Only I have access to it right now. And so that means, of course, if I want now to share my park, not to the broad public, I can't really do that in any way other than to make collaborations. So the two main reasons why I don't want to share the park right now and to set it to public are that I don't want that the park gets accessed by pretty much anybody there, even people that do not know me, and I have the fear that they would copy over my own work and misuse it to their own purposes. That's the main factor for me. I want to have there some control about who has access and who has not. I don't want that thousands of random people just copying over my stuff and I can't do anything about that. And let me be very clear here that I don't have anything against that you might reuse certain elements from my park and reuse them in your own creation. That's absolutely fine. I have nothing against that. It's just the thing I want to prevent, that there are thousands of people I don't know and that they have no idea about my project here, and they just stubbornly copy my stuff and write their name on top of it. And I can't literally do anything against that. I mean, sure, I could write Frontier that they please remove that from the workshop, but once it's out, it's out. And that's just the thing I want to prevent here. And therefore it makes much more sense to me to limit this audience who has access to the park right now in its current work in progress state. And that's also the other thing, because you can right now say, then why did you upload the Anaheim Park to the workshop and made it to public? Well, it's about the progress in the end, I think. I mean, when you look on the Anaheim Park, you have there 5 to 6 almost fully built thematic areas. Comparing that to the progress we are right now here in Orlando, it would be absolutely unfair to compare that. And that's the thing, when you load Anaheim and you might copy something over there too and declare it your own, you can't really do that, and it wouldn't make much sense to do that, just because the park is already so farly built. Right here in Orlando, we are still pretty fresh on the beginning of the main street. If somebody would decide to copy over the park, they could do that, and they could start on their very own park with this preset, so to say. And even there, I wouldn't have anything so much against that, as long as they don't declare it as their own work. If they only have it for themselves on their own PC, it's fine for me. I can live with that. It would just be very strange to me, just because I can't understand why somebody else would now use that content within their own creation, then just rebuild that whole thing entirely and call it your own. And then I think you can also be very proud of that. That's your own work. And I also know of people who are creating their very own version of the Magic Kingdom. And that's absolutely fine for me. It's a little bit strange since they are working on the exact same park as me. And so it's sometimes pretty weird to see the same thing built in a different variation of that. But really, I don't have anything against it. We are not competitors. We are people that care about the same thing they love to recreate. And that unites us in a way. And therefore, I don't see there any reason why I would question any person there who might has now the same idea of recreating the Magic Kingdom in a very realistically approach. So I don't have anything against that. But what I have something against it are people who are just copying over my stuff and declare it as their own work. And that's just the thing I want to prevent. And so far the only option where you can prevent that and make it accessible to a selected audience is to use the collaboration mode of the game. Normally you would use that mode to collaborate with your friends and to build a park together. So we would have to misuse, in a way, this mode so that you can have access to the park. So before I tell you in detail how this will work exactly, let me first talk about this membership. Since we are seeing this entire project here on this platform on YouTube, I think it makes sense to make this optional membership accessible if you are interested into that. And I want to emphasize it very clearly here that this will be optional. You don't have to buy that or feel forced to buying that in any way. All videos that I will publish here will be published freely regardless of if you are a member or not. So when you are viewing it from that perspective, nothing will change here at all. If you don't decide to become a member, then that's absolutely fine. But if you would decide to become a member, I would very much appreciate that. And most importantly, you are also helping and supporting in the continuation of this project and its future. Over the next weeks, I will make a dedicated video talking solely about this membership and also a lot more in detail. But to make it short, you will of course get there multiple levels of this membership option. Some of those levels are only designed for pure supporters that mainly want to support this project with that specific level, but some of them are also including benefits such as Discord roles, exclusive Discord channels, emojis here on YouTube, as well as logos that tell you how long you are a member on this channel. On certain levels you will also get credited in the outro and even credited in the intro. I mean, those are common things that you would expect when you enter a certain membership on YouTube. And so the very special one is of course that you will get pre-access to this Orlando park. And since those memberships are on a monthly basis, I decided that at the start of each month I will upload an updated version of the park. And so all active members will get transferred then. So if you decide to skip a month, then you will also skip the updated version. And so I believe within this membership program, it allows me now to control who has access and who has not, since I have to provide those collaborations. And each collaboration in the game is limited to 5 people, including me. So per collaboration I can only invite 4 other people. And so that means of course, the more members we will have here, the more collaboration groups I have to create each month. And I really don't know how many members we will get here. I mean, I very much appreciate that, but I just hope that it's kinda in a reasonable range and where I can update those collaborations each month. And that's something that's important to me, that it stays reasonable. The level on which you have pre-access to this park is right in the middle. So maybe you say, oh, I really enjoyed this time-lapse series so far and I would just like to see how it feels in the game. And then you just try it out for 1 month. And that's kind of the thing. I want that it doesn't exceed there into some extreme where I can realistically update those collaborations, but at the same time, it's right in that sweet spot where you can support this project to keep it running and where you also can have a sneak peek into the park itself. And so at this point, I really hope that this whole thing doesn't make the impression on you that it's a paywall, but rather another way how you can support my work on this project with the added benefit that you can see the park for yourself in the game. I mean, someday in the future, I will upload this park and release it on the workshop, regardless if you are a member or not. It should be only seen as an optional thing you are willingly to accept, and at the end it's a decision made by you and you alone. And that's exactly the way how it should be. And so to conclude now this topic, let me briefly explain how this collaboration thing would work out then if you would decide to become a member. So when you are becoming a member where you have pre-access to the park, I will DM you in Discord. And therefore it's important that you join Discord so that this whole thing works out in the end. You will tell me your Steam ID so that I can add you as a Steam friend. And once we are on Planet Coaster 2, I will also add you as a Planet Coaster friend, or how this Frontier friend system is called. After that's done, I will invite you to a collaboration group. It can be that within this group there are also other members, and I would urge here that you only view the park for now. Theoretically, you could also edit the park, but when I see there's something inappropriate, I will restore the park to its version when I uploaded it. However, what you can do, you can make little markups or little text with the text tool, for example, and mark a certain area or object. So when you see there's something does not look right, or there could be some additions made, or you just have a general comment about it, you can just make a little arrow or something like that that hints me to whatever you want to express there. That's absolutely fine. But anything else than that changes the architectural elements or the overall appearance, I will reset the park then to its original state. So after each month, I will update those collaboration groups, and if you are still an active member, then I will invite you to that. So I think I laid out all of those different things, and I talked a lot about this membership thing. And here at the very end of this topic, I just want to state another time clearly, it's really only an option, and don't feel any way forced here to anything. So maybe at this stage, let's talk a little bit more about the footage you see and this tricky bit with this curved section. So you see now the solution I came up with. I used now an actual path for this curved section. I think it's the best solution out of that. And with any scenery there is, you can't really make this curved floor. And only this path gives you now a very smooth curved section of that. And the best part about it, it's functional. You can walk upon that. Later on you will see that I enter the guest cam and I will walk up this terrace. And so that's of course pretty darn cool that it actually works, and that you can enter now this terrace and go even up to those gift shops that are at the very back of it. The only thing that is kinda annoying right now is the fact that you can see those curbs on the path itself. At the round section I tried my best to hide it within the barrier in between, but still they are visible, and it would be great if they would integrate an option here where you can disable them visually. And keep in mind, especially now in context to the next update, where we will get restaurants in the game and where those paths actually work now as restaurant floors where your guests can decide where they want to sit. And when you have their multi-store restaurant where you can sit on multiple elevation levels, it would be pretty darn cool to deactivate that curb completely. But I'm pretty certain that it's only a question of time when they're going to implement that. It's such a crucial thing, and I know that there are a lot of people that are annoyed as well as I am, and so it's only a waiting game. As I'm seeing this footage, you probably noticed that I lowered the elevation of this curved section, or to be more specific, the roof of it. At first I didn't saw that change in the elevation, but this actually makes much sense when you look from the two elevation levels that you have here, so the ground floor on Main Street and then the elevation level on top of the terrace. You have to interpolate between them, and therefore within that ramp you have their lowered ceiling to make that transition work. At first I was a little bit surprised why they didn't made the ceiling now also with an incline, so just like the floor. But then I realized that the ceiling is also following this column logic and the trim area. And so since you see this trim area also on the inside, you can't cross that section, of course. But something like that, you only see that once you build that in 3D space, and it's really not that apparent at first sight. So you also see that I placed on this trim area now like those white rectangles that divide now this section. And for that I used just this little, I don't know what's called, it's just like this little piece that has like those two tubes on one side, and I just used the flat surface of that. And so it was a little bit tricky just because it's of course a flat piece and it's not rounded or anything. And since it's placed in this round curvature, you have there certain parts that stick a little bit out, but really from the distance you won't see that at all, and it looks pretty fine. Also something that I just noticed is that this flower bed that we are creating here, it's the same flower bed that reappears on the left side. So it stretches itself over this whole side and ends very prominently in this curved section. And so I think this is another little motif that you might add to your building palette when you create your very own area, that you use their foliage or like those flower beds in a way to separate or emphasize certain building elements. For instance, here it's playing with this colonnade. All the time the colonnade appears, so is the flower bed. And on the section in the middle where you have the theater alone, you won't have this flower bed anymore. And with that technique, I think you can make your area a lot more exciting, and it adds a liveliness. You don't have there so much emptiness or coldness within it. So just in this very moment, I also tried to make those staircases functional. And at first it was a little bit tricky to place down, just because it's such a small distance between the lower level and the upper level. But it somehow worked when I used the path tool and erased with the stamp like an area of the path underneath the staircase. And then if I go to the edit mode and select those polygons of the path, at some point it snapped to the upper level and I had like a staircase there. And at least for me, it's still a little bit tricky and fiddly to work with this path system. And at some point I also tried to use two different path textures, since on the main street floor I have a different texture than on the terrace itself. And when I did that, I think I found out by accident that you can snap those two different elevation levels much better together, and they don't snap immediately, and you can drag them a little bit closer together before they starting to snap together. So overall I'm quite pleased how this turned out, and it works now. You can freely walk up and down this terrace and also the ramp on the right side. But still, this path tool, I'm really not a big fan of it. You have to literally invest 20 or 30 minutes to get something like this pretty right. And where this tool that initially should help you in creating those paths is constantly limiting you and says, oh, it's too steep, oh, it's colliding here, you can place it there. I mean, I get it. You have those limitations in place to make this tool work throughout all of the player base, into all different parks there are. I mean, it has to work in some way, right? But currently it just feels that there are still a lot of limitations, and where this whole thing doesn't look like it's really optimized. I mean, even small things like that you can't remove this curb would help immediately, and also just give us an option to make certain paths invisible. Especially for staircases, this would be great, since those pre-made vanilla staircases that get auto-generated by the path tool itself, they are just colliding with my scenery. And so it would be great to have there an option to disable them. And I know that there are certain hacks and tips on YouTube where people tell you how to create or cheese those features out of the game itself right now, but that's not really my point here. I want that the developer is caring about that, and that we as the consumers don't have to be an expert in how to trick the game now in the hardest possible way to make it work against all odds. And so I think that those two additions, that you can remove curbs and that you can also make the path invisible, are two great additions that would extremely boost the versatility and the flexibility on this path system. And really, I don't think it's too hard to implement. I mean, you have their path textures, and if you have multiple ones, you can change this texture. And then you can also change the texture to basically a blank texture, so you don't have there any texture at all, or you just increase the opacity value for it and make it transparent. So there are ways to make that, I'm pretty sure. And at least I know that I'm not alone with that opinion. There are plenty of people on Reddit, for example, that expressed now multiple times this urge, that they would love to see those curbs being removed or the option to make the path invisible. And we might just have to make Frontier aware of that. But yeah, at this point, maybe let's talk again about the build. We now finished this curved section, I would say, and we are just doing here some detail work on those facade elements. And so since we are working now on this sign here, that's just something I would love if the game would provide you there more options of creating a sign. I know that there are plenty of sign variations in the browser, but they really are so specific also in their thematic style that you can barely use them. And so wait a minute, where did I see now this polygon editing mode where you can very well construct any geometric form on a 2D plane? Oh, didn't we have this path tool? Right. So I don't want to be sarcastic here, but it would be the perfect solution for something like customly designed signs, that you can make them in pretty much all different forms and shapes that you want, since you also have the text tool, and if you have those two things, you can create pretty much any sign there is in the game. So at least here on this entrance, I just used again the art pieces, and theoretically you could make there much more detail on those signs, but for now I don't think it's really worth it to go that extra step there, and where I feel like the architecture that you see and the scenery is much more important on the overall visuals of the park. I mean, theoretically, for all those signs and specific things that reappear in the Magic Kingdom, you could of course create them in a 3D modeling software. And when we someday get the toolkit manager back, you might import them into the game. And at least for those specific signs, it would make much more sense then. But nevertheless, I think the sign that I made, it's pretty simple and easy. It's not too detailed, and I think it's a sweet balance between that. And who knows, if they decide to continue their plan on re-importing all those assets from the prequel, and where we might have certain pieces back that would work great for detailing those signs, for example. But yeah, I think we made so far a huge progress on this colonnade, and especially also the entrance with how it looks with those greenish trim area and Victorian styled architecture. I think it just looks pretty gorgeous. In a second you will see me that I transfer this column logic also to the rear side there. You have there the curtain call collectible gift shop, and in between of this area, so this colonnade and the gift shop, you have on the left side there a little courtyard that just fits in between the theater and the colonnade itself. And on the right side you have a nicely layouted, let's call it garden area, that gives so much atmosphere to this whole arrangement of this colonnade. and it's also the natural transition to the railroad track that is a little bit hidden by the foliage there. But yeah, so far really pleased with how this looks, and also I'm pretty relieved that everything worked out with this column logic. I mean, just imagine if there would be some situation where suddenly I made those columns in the wrong scale or in the wrong proportion. I would have to redo everything I did so far, not only here on this little section, but also on the restaurant and on the theater. Now, if you take a look on how it's built in real life, you will certainly spot there much more details, of course, but also slight inaccuracies that are either impossible to recreate in this game, or they are just so minor that it really doesn't make any sense to really invest time and effort to recreate them. And that's kind of the thing here. It would be not wise to recreate everything there is, like on paper. You have to decide on all those items individually, how important they are for the overall visual of the park. And it's also a question what looks good in this game. I mean, it's not a 3D model here. It's not a live simulation. Since it's a game, you have to adapt to the graphical style of the game itself. And you have to find your own style within that, and to have a balance between the recreation, how it looks in real life, and how it looks now in this game. And depending on that, certain details or certain things that appear in real life are just impossible to recreate here. And if you would now go for a hyper-realistic appearance of the park, I think it doesn't really look good in the end. Sure, it would be accurate as hell, but you need a healthy mix here between the game visuals and what you are going to recreate. So when you take, for instance, a physical model, you are also kinda limited and bound to a certain visual and appearance of this model. For a physical model, you are mostly limited by the scale and the materials it's built out of, and there's just no way that you can make it as realistic like the thing in real life. It can of course look realistic, but this is always a subjective interpretation on our part. It can't be 100% the same thing in a physical way like it is in reality. And so when we talk about realism in a video game, for example, we are always bound to that, to the visual appearance, how things are rendered within this game. So we can't really escape that limitation here. And therefore it's important that we understand whatever we are building here, we have to see it in the context of this game. And the more I think about this limitation, the more I come to the conclusion that it's sometimes pretty wise to reduce down certain details to a certain degree of abstractness. And this will increase the visual clarity when you look on them. There isn't so much clutter when you look on them, especially when you are far away. Sometimes if you have there a really detailed sign that is super small compared to the overall size of this whole main street, then it doesn't really make sense to recreate that, or to only recreate it in a abstractive way that makes sense to the visual style of the game itself. And maybe it has even to do with the way how we see things in a video game compared to how we see things in reality. I mean, since you are a human, most probably, I hope so, you are bound to your two eyes that you have, and you have a very conical view on things. And wherever you look, you focus on a specific thing. And therefore you have a zone there that is focused and the rest of it is a little bit blurred. And so you decide what is now in the focus and what's not. And that means, of course, if you experience this theme park in reality, when you move around with your eyes, you will always focus on specific things that might be interesting to you. And the thing here that makes the difference is the distance to all things around you. So depending on what you look at, may it be like a trash bin, like 1 meter in front of you, or like a very small sign like 30 meters away from you, you can focus on those things in like a blink of a second. When you now take the game, for example, It works here a bit differently just because you are bound to this monitor that is pretty much at all time half a meter in front of you. And therefore you can't really play with this distance thing. Of course, in this 3D rendered space, there are things that are more far away and that are less far away. And so theoretically and physically speaking, all those things that you might see in the game are at the same distance to you, to your eyes, and how you look on this monitor the whole time. They might look to you like they are more far away or closer, but that's a pure illusion. And that's also, by the way, my explanation why animals can't see perspective depth, for instance on a monitor. If you set them in front of a monitor, they won't recognize any space there. They only see their 2D surface, and their brain doesn't make any clue out of what they are watching there. And therefore I think you can't really recreate a realistic simulation, especially here in this game, that you can compare even close to what you would experience in real life. And that's just something that we have to accept. There are natural limitations, not only by the game, but also by science and physics. I mean, I would absolutely love if there would be at some day the possibility of getting much closer to the experience that you will have in a real theme park. And maybe to a certain extent you can already do that right now with VR classes. I don't know if Landcoaster has active support for that. But even then, it wouldn't even come close to the real experience you would get if you visit this park in real life. And unless we are in the Matrix, I don't see any way how we in the near future should achieve something like that. But I have to say that alone the impression of that is pretty cool. But however, I think at this stage we should come back to the build. And as you see, we made it now to this garden section. And I layouted here the border, so to say, or like this circular wall that separates now this section to the railroad track. And I just think it's a beautiful location now to introduce some foliage to this area. And it also makes perfect sense on this location. When you imagine how you enter this area, you have to make a deliberate decision. You have to take some steps to get there. So you have the same thing happening like on the other side. And therefore, the first stage is this colonnade, which introduces you to this area. Then you come to the second area, which is this garden and this courtyard. So it spaces everything a little bit out to make this area a lot more pleasing, atmospheric. And after that, it leads up to the final stage, and that is the gift shop. So there is a deliberate intention how this area is designed and how it's spaced out. Or as I like to call it, there's a certain dramaturgy that happens, and where I almost get the impression that they want to lure you in. At first they want you to make the decision to go here by yourself, but they want to keep you as long within this area as possible. And that's of course no accident. Later on, when we working on those themed areas, you will see this motive coming up very often. And this motive of keeping you as long as possible within a certain area, it does not only apply now to theme parks. You will constantly experiencing that wherever somebody wants to sell you something. So for instance, in your local supermarket or a home improvement store or any store there is. I mean, here in Germany, the most prime example is IKEA, this Swedish furniture store. And their core concept is, in order to get to the checkout, you literally have to walk completely through the whole store. So even if you don't want to, you get kind of forced into doing that. And that's just due to the whole design nature of this whole thing, how it's planned. They want, of course, to influence you on the way out, that you stay as long as possible within the store, that you might buy something else that you not necessarily need, but that's their concept. And it's not only IKEA now, it's also pretty much every store there is in the world. But the big difference to a theme park like the Magic Kingdom here, that they make the experience of that so much more enjoyable and worthwhile. So in supermarkets, I get really annoyed by that, just because it's so inconvenient if you just want to buy a little snack and you have to walk miles and miles until you reach finally the checkout. But here, you get entertained on the way out of it, and that's the big difference. They actually make an effort on the way out of it. So at this point, let me come back to the build. As you see, I just placed down those hedges within this little round section in the wall. And I also did a little step back there in the wall itself. And it's really a nice detail, I think. And so the middle of that gets emphasized by this double-barreled hedge wall. And I even made sure that there are different elevations happening, not only in the wall itself, but also on the hedge itself. And again, this emphasizes this area even more. So right here you can see that the circle that I tried to recreate with those hedges is not a perfect circle. And so I just plopped down here an art piece to make it properly round. And so always when I see such hedge formations in this very symmetrical and geometric pattern, I feel a strong resemblance to baroque gardens and what you would see, for example, in Versailles. And if my memory doesn't fool me, we already talked about Versailles, I believe. I mean, there it was a completely different mindset, what they actually wanted to express with that. They wanted to showcase the absolute power of their monarchy and of their empire and show it off in the architecture and its surroundings, in this case the garden and the foliage. This garden should also follow now the norms and orders of that given empire. So they had this absolutism that the nature itself has to bow before their regency, which is of course a terrible and pretty disgusting mindset, and where I'm sure that they used now those gardens just as a reference to create them also here. They don't have the same meaning attached with it. That's pretty certain, I would say. But I find it just very intriguing that something that can be so beautiful like the Garden of Versailles has such a terrible anecdote to it, right? And whenever I see those hedge formations, I also see this bad side, and that you can have both good and evil coexisting at the same time. And so maybe let me extend that a little bit more freely now, and don't take my word now for it. But when you project now this logic that you always have something good, you also have something bad. Because how do you know that something is good? You only know that by not having the bad thing happening. And so both of those states, they are in a way depending on their counterpart to be active. Otherwise, if none of them existed, they would be neutral. And you wouldn't say, oh, it's good or it's bad. You would just not bother about it. And that's kinda interesting, I think. And when you project now this logic to the stories of Disney, for example, it makes very much sense then why those stories are always about good and evil. I mean, think about them for a second. Snow White, Bambi, Dumbo, Mary Poppins. I mean, a story without something bad happening wouldn't be a story, right? When there would only be good things happening, it would be pretty boring and really also not much happening. Humans are very emotional creatures, and therefore we need their up and downs. In our lives, we not only remembering the good things, we also remember the bad things. And therefore only if there is a dramaturgy of up and downs, that's what makes a good story. And maybe you can even apply that to certain architecture or scenery. No, I'm just kidding. I don't think that really bothers here, but I just think it was a nice little route how you can also capture this topic. I mean, this is really a topic that could fill entire episodes just because it's the core principle all of those stories are built upon. Without that, we wouldn't have Disney. But that's for another day. Before I will conclude today's episode, I would like to recap what we built so far. So as you see, I'm finishing up this area, and the only thing that is still missing are those bigger trees, but I will place them later on when I finish the buildings around it. But overall, I think it turned out pretty beautifully, and I'm so relieved that I don't have to rework this colonnade anymore. And especially this round part was quite tricky to build. Maybe it was the trickiest thing overall in this build so far, but there are certainly much more trickier things to come, I'm pretty sure. With that being said, I would like to conclude today's episode, and as I said, we made a huge progress so far, and it gives us the perfect starting position for the next episode, where we start off with the roof and with the remaining facades on those buildings. And once that's done, we can move on beyond it to the Emporium building and the actual start of this main street. Saying that, it gets me pretty excited and I can't wait for it. And so to properly conclude now this episode, I thought I'd just put some footage here of the area that we constructed today, and I just wanted to say some additional things. So as I said now multiple times, I will be on vacation for 2 weeks when this video gets released, and after it, when I return, I will activate this membership. I will release there also a dedicated video talking solely about this membership in much more detail, since it's quite complicated, I think, if I would just refer all the time to this episode. So if you would decide to become a member, I would appreciate that, of course, and would be very thankful for that. But I will say it here one last time, it's only an option. Don't overthink it, and don't feel forced to anything here. I will continue to build this park and to provide those videos in this time-lapse series completely free of charge. It should be only seen as a way to support this work, including some little benefits, of course. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, subscribe, like or comment, join as a member in a very short time, join our Discord server, watch my other videos about Anaheim or Orlando, and thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.